A gavel struck the bench with the finality of a guillotine, slicing through the suffocating stillness of the courtroom. For Judge Caleb Whitaker, it was just another Tuesday. Another case closed. Another life dismantled and filed away. The man in the defendant's box, Darius, a black man, was nothing more than another line item. A face that would vanish from memory before Whitaker's lunch arrived. But today, the judge had made a grave error. He fancied himself the puppeteer of this room, a man above consequence, blind to the truth that his courtroom was a crime scene. His gavel? Not a symbol of justice, but a blunt instrument in a scheme he couldn't control. And the man he just sentenced? He's the one with the power to bring Whitaker's entire empire crashing down. Dear viewer, before we begin, please write in the comments where you are watching from, and support us with a like and a subscribe. Oak Haven was a city wearing a borrowed face. Its skyline shimmered with the illusion of progress, banners boasting renewal and growth. But beneath the polished surface, something was festering. Corruption ran deep, infecting every layer of the city's foundation. And at the rotten core of it all was a name that echoed in whispers: Matteo, the Viper DeLuca. He ruled the criminal underworld with ruthless precision, but his real strength didn't come from muscle or violence. It came from signatures and silence, from decisions handed down in courtroom 4B, Judge Whitaker's domain. For 2 long years, the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force had been circling DeLuca, slowly tightening the net. They had tapped phones, flipped informants, and stacked mountains of indirect evidence. But each time the case neared a courtroom, it unraveled like thread in a storm. Witnesses went quiet. Crucial evidence vanished into legal loopholes. And every time, DeLuca walked away untouched. The rot wasn't in the police force. It was deeper. It was sitting on the bench. That's where Adrian Keats came in. Officially, Adrian was the newly promoted assistant director of the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division. A man with a reputation for razor-sharp instincts and a moral compass that didn't budge. His gaze could shake even the most hardened criminals. But in Oak Haven, he'd become someone else entirely, Darius Cole. A man with no record, no roots, and just enough of a desperate backstory to make him the perfect mark. The operation was bold, borderline reckless. Adrian himself was going undercover. At the briefing in D.C., his colleagues had called it too risky. But Adrian was adamant. We can't just send in any agent, he'd argued. Whitaker and DeLuca have eyes everywhere. They'll smell a Fed from across the street. What they need to see is a nobody, someone they think they can crush without a second thought. That means it has to be me. For 6 weeks, Adrian shed everything that defined him. He let his hair grow out, ditched the suits for tattered jeans and threadbare tees. He scrubbed dishes in dingy diners and hauled crates at the docks for cash under the table. He rented a 1-bedroom in a forgotten corner of the city where the street lights didn't always work and the trash was picked up late, if at all. He disappeared into Darius Cole, learning the rhythms of survival, the coded language of poverty, the exhaustion of being judged before speaking a word. He watched the law twist in real time. Officers Owen Bartlett and Tyler McCord, the street-level muscle for Judge Whitaker, cruised the neighborhood like it belonged to them. They extorted local shop owners and harassed young men for sport. They weren't just cops. They were the judge's foot soldiers, keeping the fear alive. The setup was simple. Get arrested, and not just by anyone, but by Bartlett and McCord. And it had to be big enough to bypass plea deals and land him straight in front of Whitaker. That moment arrived on a damp evening, the kind that made the city feel heavier. Adrian was walking home, the cash from his shift still warm in his pocket. A cruiser swerved in beside him, lights flashing, slicing the alley into shards of red and blue. Bartlett stepped out first, eyes gleaming with smug delight. "Well, look at this," he sneered. "Walking kind of fast, aren't you? Got somewhere you need to be?" Adrian, ever in character, lowered his gaze and slumped his shoulders. "Just heading home, officers." "Let's see some ID," McCord barked, one hand hovering near his holstered weapon. Adrian handed over the forged ID, Darius Cole, with a backstory curated for exactly this moment. McCord read the name aloud, grinning. Now where does a guy like you belong, huh? He passed the ID to Bartlett, who studied it under the beam of his flashlight. What's in the bag? He asked, nodding toward Adrian's backpack. Just my work stuff? We'll be the judge of that, Bartlett said, smirking as he yanked the bag from Adrian's shoulder. Its contents hit the wet pavement with a soft plop: an extra shirt, a dog-eared novel, a half-eaten sandwich, and a small plastic bag filled with white powder. The trap was set. Adrian didn't blink. He widened his eyes with feigned shock and confusion. What is that? That's not mine. I swear, I've never seen that before. McCord let out a barking laugh. Classic. Owen, we got ourselves a real comedian here. Looks like 2 ounces of bad decisions, Bartlett added, already pulling out the cuffs. Darius Cole, you're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute. Cold metal snapped around Adrian's wrists. He didn't struggle. He didn't speak. He played the role perfectly, silent, rattled, powerless. As they shoved him into the back of the cruiser, he caught a glimpse of Bartlett texting someone. The phone's glow lit up the officer's grin. It was a message meant for someone deep in the shadows, a burner phone in a glove box somewhere. A signal. The machine had started. The gears were turning. Adrian, no, Darius, was being escorted straight into the heart of a system designed to crush men like him. Central booking was a blur of fluorescent lights and human despair. The air was a mixture of bleach, body odor, and anxiety. And Darius Cole? He was right where he needed to be. For Adrian Keats, a man who had once dismantled international criminal networks with strategic precision, this was a new kind of battlefield. Here, the enemy wasn't a cartel kingpin or foreign operative. It was slower, more insidious, a grinding, bureaucratic indifference baked into the bones of a system built to break the spirit long before it broke the body. As Darius Cole, he moved through intake like cattle in a chute, fingerprinted, photographed, stripped of his belt and shoelaces, and handed a number in place of a name. Every step was meant to erase identity, to chip away at dignity. The desk clerks barely looked up. The guards made no effort to hide their contempt. In the holding cell, Adrian found himself surrounded by a blend of hardened lifers and scared young men experiencing their first taste of incarceration. He sat somewhere in between, outwardly calm, inwardly vigilant. He studied the cracks in the machine, each sneer, each shortcut, each shrug of power misused. And he filed it all away. After a sleepless night spent on a metal bench colder than the concrete beneath it, he was summoned for arraignment. In a stale, windowless room, he met the woman who would serve as his public defender. She entered briskly, dark circles shadowing her eyes, a mountain of case files slung over her shoulder like battle gear. Nina Carver, she said with clipped efficiency, taking the seat across from him. I'm your attorney, and we don't have much time. They'll be calling your name any minute, so listen up. She didn't sugarcoat it. You're Darius Cole, arrested for possession with intent, 2 ounces of cocaine. Officers Owen Bartlett and Tyler McCord say it was in plain view inside your bag. That's serious. The weight alone triggers mandatory minimums. The DA's not going to do you any favors. She rattled it off like someone who had recited this script 100 times to 100 different men. Adrian studied her. Beneath the exhaustion, the cynicism, there was a flicker of something. Someone who had once believed this job could matter. It wasn't mine, he said, his voice low but steady. They planted it. Nina exhaled hard, the sound part disbelief, part fatigue. Mr. Cole, they all say that. And I'm juggling 23 active cases. I need more than they planted it. Did they have probable cause? Did you say anything incriminating? They stopped me for walking too fast, Adrian replied evenly. And no, I said nothing. That got her attention. Not the words, but the way he said them. No panic, no desperation, just clarity. She glanced back at the file, then at his eyes, alert, measured, too composed for a man facing serious time. Bartlett and McCord, she muttered under her breath. Always so by the book, it's suspicious. She sighed again. Look, your bail hearing's next. Judge Caleb Whitaker is on the bench. He's notorious, especially with drug charges. Say nothing unless I tell you to. Nod. Look respectful. Our only goal right now is survival. We'll deal with the rest later. Minutes later, Adrian was shackled to a line of other men in orange jumpsuits and led into courtroom 4B. The room was clad in old wood paneling, clearly designed to inspire reverence. But the truth was in the details, the dust floating in slivers of light, the faint odor of mildew. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like decay. And then he saw him. Judge Caleb Whitaker loomed above from his elevated perch, black robe draped over his ample frame. His face was all severity, small, calculating eyes, and a mouth perpetually pulled into a scowl of contempt. He moved with the ease of a man who had long ago stopped questioning his own authority. The prosecutor wasted no time, rattling off the charges. Mr. Cole, Whitaker said at last, finally peering down at Adrian with a sneer disguised as disapproval. Possession with intent to distribute. Poisoning the very streets we work to protect. You people come into this city, and he stopped himself, catching a subtle warning glance from the court clerk. This court, he corrected, has zero tolerance for this kind of filth. Nina rose to speak. Your Honor, my client has no prior convictions. He has local ties, albeit limited, and poses no flight risk. We request bail be set at a reasonable level. Whitaker let out a derisive sniff. No priors that we know of. These transients are a blight, drifting in, causing harm, then disappearing. He turned his gaze back to Adrian, cold and unwavering. Bail is denied. Remanded to custody until trial. The gavel cracked down, and the noise echoed like the slam of a prison door. Next case. As Adrian was led away in chains, his eyes locked with Whitaker's for a fleeting second. Adrian gave him nothing, just a blank, defeated stare. But inside, something had ignited. The phrase, you people, the way Whitaker had toyed with presumption and prejudice like tools of the trade, it wasn't a misstep. It was the tell, the show, the reveal. Whitaker wasn't delivering justice. He was performing power. Back in holding, the weight of it all pressed in. Adrian knew his team was monitoring. Somewhere, agents were watching. But for the others in that cell, this wasn't theater. This was life. This was reality. He was now deep within the machine, feeling every inch of its gears grinding against him. The Oak Haven County Detention Center wasn't just a jail. It was its own twisted society, a network of cement and steel governed by its own cruel rules. And for Adrian, it was the perfect place to listen. Without his badge, his title, or the weight of his authority, Adrian Keats was just another inmate, a face in a crowd of jumpsuits. But in a place like this, being overlooked wasn't a liability, it was leverage. It gave him space to observe, to blend, to become a ghost in plain sight. His FBI instincts kicked into high gear, transforming every waking moment into a mission. He studied the rhythm of the detention center like a living organism, its unwritten rules, the social hierarchy, the quiet economy of fear and favor. He tuned into the guards' offhand conversations, noting their biases, their blind spots, and the cracks in their discipline. Among the inmates, he decoded the subtle nods, the hand gestures, the way silence carried as much meaning as words. He wasn't just looking to survive. He was looking to expose the arteries of corruption that ran from the street to the courthouse. That's when he found his unlikely informant, in the prison library. It was a cramped, dust-choked room stacked with worn paperbacks and discarded law books. But for some, it was sanctuary. And at the center of that refuge was Eldon "Pops" Walker. 20 years into a life sentence, Pops ran the library like a monk ran a chapel. Quiet, respected, and completely in the know. Adrian started frequenting the library under the pretense of reading. He didn't push or interrogate. He asked about books, about life behind bars, and he listened. Pops, a man who had long since learned to spot masks, seemed to sense something different in Darius Cole. He saw a man who wasn't crushed by the system, but was quietly studying its blueprints. One afternoon, while reshelving books, Adrian dropped the bait. Picked up by Bartlett and McCord, he said casually. Planted a bag on me. Pops didn't even glance up from the novel he was mending. The welcoming committee, he muttered, voice low and raspy. That's what we call them. They bring fresh meat straight into the grinder. Adrian kept his tone even. Whitaker, there's only one judge that matters for cases like yours, Pops said, finally locking eyes with him. His gaze was old but razor sharp. Whitaker runs his court like a factory. The cops deliver the parts, he stamps out convictions, and the product gets sent here. Everybody gets what they want. Adrian leaned in slightly. And what does Whitaker want? Pops gave a hollow, humorless laugh. Same thing all-powerful men want. More money, more control. You don't get a house in Silver Lake and Ivy League tuition on a judge's salary unless someone's paying your tab. Someone like Matteo De Luca, Adrian said, letting the name hang in the air like a dropped match. The change in Pops was instant. The gentle librarian faded, and in his place was a hardened inmate suddenly alert. You don't say that name in here, he said, voice sharp. Not unless you want to end up with a shiv in your back. Some walls have ears, and some of those ears belong to the Viper himself. The conversation ended there, but Adrian didn't need more. He had his confirmation. The connection between DeLuca, Whitaker, and the street-level enforcers like Bartlett and McCord was no longer a theory. It was an open secret behind bars. Whitaker wasn't just biased. He was a key player in a well-oiled criminal machine, one that eliminated rivals, fast-tracked sentences for outsiders, and protected DeLuca's territory. And while Adrian worked the inside, Nina Carver was starting to unravel things on the outside. The police report, crafted with surgical precision by Bartlett and McCord, began to crack under scrutiny. A conveniently missing 3-minute gap in the dashcam footage, right during the stop. A chain of custody that looked more like scribbled nonsense than a legal trail. And the deeper she dug into past cases, the more patterns she saw. Dozens of defendants, all with similar stories. All people of color. All stopped for vague infractions. All suddenly in possession of large amounts of drugs. Nearly every case routed through Whitaker's courtroom. Nearly every case ending in swift, unchallenged conviction. It was a system. Nina scheduled another visit with Adrian at the detention center. She leaned across the table in the sterile visitation room, her voice hushed but urgent. You were right, she said, eyes locked on his. This isn't just about you or those officers. It's bigger. I found at least 15 other cases that mirror yours. But it's still just a pattern. It's not enough to prove conspiracy. Adrian stayed composed. What about the dash cam? She shook her head, clearly frustrated. Report says equipment malfunction. Surprise, surprise. It's a dead end. They're covering for each other, and the DA's office isn't asking questions. Her voice dropped lower. If we're going to win this, I need more than patterns. I need something explosive, something that cracks this thing open from the inside. Adrian didn't respond right away. His expression gave away nothing. He knew the FBI team was working the angles, tracing financial records, monitoring calls, building a case piece by piece. But Nina didn't know that. As far as she could see, she was waging this war alone, with only her instincts and a growing storm of outrage as fuel. Then keep digging, Adrian told her, his tone steady. Make them talk at trial. Let them lie. Let them contradict themselves. Every lie they tell is a thread. Pull hard enough, and the whole thing will come apart. Nina sat back, staring at the man the world had labeled a street-level dealer. But he spoke like a general prepping for battle. And for the first time, she didn't see a hopeless case. She saw a spark, a fight worth joining, a man who wasn't just ready for war. He'd come to win it. The day of the trial settled over Oak Haven like a storm front. Heavy, still, suffocating. Courtroom 4B was Judge Caleb Whitaker's stage, and as he swept in, his black robes flaring behind him like a warning flag, he made one thing painfully clear. This was his show. He offered Prosecutor Peter Albright a warm, almost chummy nod, then turned to Nina Carver with a look that could strip paint. The message was unmistakable. You're not welcome here. Jury selection unfolded like a masterclass in manipulation. Whitaker's subtle nudges and carefully phrased questions steered the process like a conductor guiding a symphony. The result? A panel of mostly older, mostly white jurors, people who viewed law enforcement as saviors, not suspects. Nina fought hard, burning through her limited challenges to eliminate the most blatantly biased, but she knew the trial had already been stacked against her. Albright took center stage with the smug assurance of a man who believed the verdict was already written. In his opening statement, he painted Darius Cole as a menace, a stranger who came to Oak Haven to poison its streets. Holding up the plastic evidence bag like a relic of righteousness, he declared it a ticket to death, and cast Bartlett and McCord as noble warriors keeping the community safe. When Nina stood, the contrast was jarring. She didn't pace. She didn't grandstand. She simply looked the jury in the eye and spoke with quiet conviction. This case isn't about cocaine, she said. It's about control, about what happens when power goes unchecked. What you'll hear is a story, crafted by two officers who've told it too many times. A story full of missing pieces. And what you'll see is that Darius Cole isn't a dealer, he's a target. Judge Whitaker leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled, wearing the expression of a man stuck in a meeting he didn't care about. The performance had begun. Officer Owen Bartlett was the prosecution's first witness, and he delivered his lines flawlessly. Calm, composed, and every inch the professional, he recounted how he and Tyler McCord spotted Cole acting suspicious, conducted a routine stop, and discovered narcotics in plain view. It was textbook testimony, almost too perfect. Nina rose slowly from her seat. Officer Bartlett, she began, you said you stopped Mr. Cole for walking too fast. Could you define, legally, what constitutes walking too fast? Objection. Albright barked. Relevance. Sustained, Whitaker said, barely glancing up. Nina shifted. Your report also mentions a 3-minute dash cam malfunction. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am, Bartlett replied smoothly. The equipment isn't always reliable. Isn't it convenient? She said under her breath, just loud enough to be heard. Whitaker shot her a warning glare. In your experience, how often does this kind of malfunction happen? From time to time. And did it occur before or after you claimed to find the drugs? Bartlett hesitated, just a beat too long. I believe, around the same time. So the only objective footage that could confirm or disprove your account vanished at the exact moment the crucial evidence was found. Objection. Argumentative, Albright snapped. Sustained, Whitaker growled. Miss Carver, move on, or I will hold you in contempt. And so it continued. Officer Tyler McCord followed, and his testimony mirrored Bartlett's down to the word. The same language, the same phrases. It was less testimony and more script reading. Nina jabbed where she could, looking for inconsistencies, contradictions, anything. But Whitaker was a brick wall, batting down her objections with thinly veiled contempt. From the defense table, Adrian watched it all, silent, unreadable. He played his role to perfection, the hopeless, defeated man with nowhere to run. But beneath that still surface, his mind ticked like a metronome. He watched the jury, some already skeptical, some visibly siding with the officers. He watched Nina fight a losing battle. And he watched Whitaker revel in the illusion of control. During recess, Nina collapsed beside him on the bench, her shoulders tight with frustration. I'm sorry, Darius, she whispered. I can't land a single hit. They see me as combative, and those two clowns as heroes. We're losing. Adrian turned toward her, his voice quiet but resolute. You're not losing. You're exposing. Every time they lie, every time they dodge, you're leaving footprints. You're forcing the system to reveal itself. Just keep going. His calm unnerved her, but it also steadied her. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was arguing into the void. The prosecution closed with a clean-cut forensic analyst who confirmed the white powder was cocaine and that the quantity suggested intent to distribute. It was cold, technical testimony, the kind that juries love because it feels inarguable. By the time Albright rested his case, the courtroom felt wrapped in inevitability. He smirked at the jury. Whitaker checked his watch. Everyone in the room could see the ending coming. Everyone was wrong. The defense had nothing left but one last move. No physical evidence. No witnesses. Just the word of a man the system had labeled a criminal. Nina had hesitated until Adrian insisted, so she called Darius Cole to the stand. Adrian rose with quiet authority, walking with a posture that didn't match the orange jumpsuit. He stepped into the witness box like it belonged to him, not like he was borrowing time. He raised his hand, swore the oath, and when he spoke, the room went still. His voice cut through the silence, clear and steady, and everything began to shift. Nina Carver guided Adrian Keats through his testimony with practiced care, but it was he who carried the moment. Calm, measured, and unwavering, Adrian recounted every step of that night. How he'd simply been walking home, how he was stopped without cause, and how the drugs were planted by officers Owen Bartlett and Tyler McCord. His tone never rose, never cracked. He didn't plead. He simply told the truth. Then came the cross. Prosecutor Peter Albright approached with the air of a predator, eyes gleaming, voice dripping with condescension. He circled Adrian like a lion sizing up its prey. "Mr. Cole," Albright began, practically spitting the name. "You expect this jury to believe that two decorated officers, with careers on the line, chose to frame you, a man with no job, no roots, no record? What possible motive would they have?" Adrian met his gaze without blinking. "You'd have to ask them." "Oh, I will," Albright said, sneering as he turned to the jury. "But I'll also ask them to consider this. You arrived in Oak Haven just weeks ago. No background, no family, no connections. It's almost like you're hiding something." He pushed harder, tried to provoke, to trip Adrian up, but it was like throwing punches at a wall. Adrian never flinched. His answers were brief, honest, and immovable. The prosecutor's frustration simmered just beneath his polished exterior, but the damage was done. Because in the end, the truth didn't matter. The jury left the courtroom, and they returned in under 20 minutes. The speed alone was a gut punch. The foreman, a stiff, expressionless man who hadn't once looked Adrian in the eye during the trial, handed a slip of paper to the bailiff. It was passed to Whitaker, who read it quietly. A faint smirk curled at the corners of his mouth. He cleared his throat. "On the charge of possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute," he intoned, "we, the jury, find the defendant, Darius Cole." He paused, savoring the moment. "Guilty." The words hit like a hammer. A murmur of approval rippled through the prosecution's side. Nina sank back into her seat, stunned, as though the wind had been knocked from her. She reached out, placing a hand gently on Adrian's forearm. It was meant to comfort, but he didn't move, didn't blink. He just stared straight ahead at the judge. Then Whitaker pounced. "Sentencing will proceed immediately," he said, practically gleeful. "Mr. Cole, please rise." Adrian stood, smooth and unhurried, as though nothing about this moment surprised him. Whitaker leaned forward, ready to bask in his self-righteousness. He removed his glasses, set them down, and looked at Adrian with open contempt. "Darius Cole, this court finds you guilty of trafficking poison through our streets. Yours is not just a legal offense, it is a moral rot. You, and people like you, infect this city, preying on the vulnerable, contributing nothing." His voice rose with fury, the courtroom fading away as he launched into a tirade. "You are a liar, a criminal, a parasite, and this court will not tolerate your kind." He delivered the sentence like a man wielding a sword. 15 years in state prison. No parole for the first 10. Let this be a warning. And that's when Adrian spoke. "Your Honor," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the judge's rant like a blade. The courtroom stilled. Even Whitaker froze. The defendant will remain silent. You have nothing more to. On the contrary, Your Honor, Adrian said, voice rising in clarity and force. Before sentencing is finalized, I believe I'm entitled to make a statement. And I have a great deal to say. Nina looked at him in alarm. This wasn't part of the plan. She reached for him, whispered urgently, tried to reel him back, but he gently brushed her hand aside. Across the bench, Whitaker smirked. Intrigued. Confident. He leaned back, waving his hand as if granting a condemned man one last pathetic indulgence. By all means, Mr. Cole, he said, voice thick with mockery. Entertain us. The judge thought he was handing Adrian a rope to hang himself. But Adrian had come to burn the gallows down. He turned and scanned the courtroom, the jurors, the officers, the clerk, his attorney. And finally, he locked eyes with Judge Caleb Whitaker. The hunted had turned predator. Thank you, Your Honor, Adrian said. Gone was the defeated, soft-spoken man who had sat through the trial. The voice that now rang out was crisp, commanding. It belonged to someone no longer playing a role. For the past 3 days, he began, you've heard a story. A well-rehearsed performance. One designed to paint me as a threat and portray officers Bartlett and McCord as noble defenders of the public. He turned slightly, addressing the jury now. But as Miss Carver pointed out, it's just that. A story. A fiction full of holes. He let the silence stretch, then added, take the dash cam footage, for example. 3 minutes conveniently missing during the most crucial part of the stop. According to Officer Bartlett, it was a glitch. He turned his head slowly toward Bartlett, who stood by the prosecution table, arms crossed, smug as ever. The equipment didn't fail, Officer Bartlett, Adrian said, his voice slicing through the tension like a scalpel. It was manually turned off at exactly 9:14 p.m., then switched back on at 9:17. Just enough time for Officer McCord to step out of the vehicle, walk over to me, and slide a bag of narcotics, already stashed in your glove compartment, into my backpack. Bartlett's confident smirk evaporated. His face went ghost white. Albright bolted to his feet. Objection. The defendant is making outrageous, unsubstantiated accusations. Adrian didn't even look at him. I'm just getting started. He turned toward Judge Caleb Whitaker, locking eyes with the man who had held so many fates in the balance. This setup, Adrian said, was precise, calculated, just like the 15 other cases prosecuted in this courtroom over the last 2 years. Every single one involved minority defendants. Every single one involved the same 2 officers. And every single one ended with the harshest possible sentence, delivered by you. Whitaker's face, once so smug and self-assured, began to crumble into open disbelief. Rage twitched at the corners of his eyes. Bailiff, he barked, restrain the defendant. This farce is over. But the 2 officers flanking Adrian didn't move. They were frozen, transfixed. I wouldn't, Adrian said calmly. His gaze drifted toward the courtroom doors. Because this isn't an outburst, Your Honor. This is a debrief. He shifted his focus to Albright. And you, Adrian continued. You wanted to know why 2 decorated officers would risk everything to frame a nobody? They didn't do it alone. They were following orders. Just like you're told which cases to pursue, which defendants to bury, and which ones to let walk. Then his eyes returned to Whitaker, and his voice turned to ice. They do it for the same reason you do, Judge. For the money. For the monthly transfers from Mateo DeLuca's slush funds, funneled through shell corporations, ending in a Cayman Islands account. Number 734-9B-41. The courtroom erupted in gasps. All the oxygen had been sucked from the room. Nina Carver stared at her client. No, not her client, with eyes wide in disbelief. How could he know this? Whitaker slammed his gavel, again and again, the sharp cracks no longer commanding authority, but echoing like desperation. Contempt. I hold you in contempt. This is a mockery. No, Judge. Adrian cut in, louder now, commanding the space. This is a federal sting operation, and you are its primary target. And then, as if summoned by those very words, Adrian reached into the pocket of his orange jumpsuit, something no inmate should have been able to do, and pulled out a flat black object. He held it high, an FBI badge. The courtroom froze. "My name is not Darius Cole," he declared, his voice now clear, thunderous. "I'm Assistant Director Adrian Keats of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." At that moment, the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. 12 agents swept in, clad in navy blue vests marked FBI, their formation swift and surgical. Leading them was a sharp-eyed woman who zeroed in on Adrian. "Director Keats," she said crisply. "Perimeter secured." Panic rippled through the courtroom. The gallery erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Jurors stared slack-jawed. And officers Bartlett and McCord, frozen like statues, watched as 2 agents closed in. They didn't run. They couldn't. The color drained from their faces, replaced by the sickly hue of men who knew their empire had just collapsed. Albright collapsed into his chair, stunned and silent. But Adrian's focus was locked on only one man. Judge Caleb Whitaker was halfway to his feet, trembling. His gavel had fallen from his hand. His face, ashen. That black robe, no longer a symbol of justice. Now it looked like mourning cloth. "Caleb Whitaker," Adrian said with quiet finality, "you are under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, and obstruction of justice." 2 agents approached the bench, now officially a crime scene. They cuffed the judge, who sputtered incoherently, powerless. Just minutes ago, he had been the most feared man in the room. Now he was a prisoner. Adrian stood tall, still in his jumpsuit, a living contradiction, a symbol of everything the judge had tried to crush. He had walked into the heart of corruption disguised as a victim and detonated the whole rotten machine from the inside out. The aftermath unfolded in a whirlwind of sirens, flashbulbs, and whispered chaos. Courtroom 4B, once the sanctum of Whitaker's unchecked power, had been exposed as nothing more than a stage for organized crime, and its ringleader was now being led away in handcuffs. Bartlett and McCord didn't resist. There was nothing left to resist. Their kingdom of fear had collapsed in under 5 minutes. Their blank stares said it all. They knew it was over. Nina remained seated, her mind spinning. The man she had defended, fought for, had just pulled off one of the most complex operations she'd ever witnessed. And she had been part of it without ever knowing. Everything she'd suspected about the system, it wasn't just true. It was worse. And it had become the subject of a full-scale federal takedown. Then Adrian turned to her. The steel in his expression softened, just slightly. "Miss Carver," he said, his voice quiet, sincere. "I owe you an apology. The deception was necessary. But I want you to know what you did in that courtroom. How you fought. It didn't go unnoticed." He offered a faint, respectful nod. "You are one of the finest public defenders I've ever seen. You fought for me," Adrian said, his voice sincere and steady. "When you had every reason not to. You kept your oath alive, even in a courtroom where justice was a facade." Nina blinked, speechless. I don't understand. You let them convict you." Before Adrian could respond, Agent Elena Navarro stepped forward. "We had to," she explained. "That conviction, that sentence from Judge Whitaker, was the linchpin, the final act that connected every piece of the conspiracy. By framing Director Keats, he unwittingly completed the case against himself." And just like that, the operation's true name was revealed, Fallen Gavel. Over the next few hours, the scope of the mission came into focus. While Adrian infiltrated the system from within, his FBI team had been assembling a mountain of evidence from the outside: financial trails, surveillance footage, protected witnesses. Together, it formed an airtight case that reached far beyond one crooked judge. As Whitaker was processed at the federal building, coordinated raids rippled across Oak Haven. Mateo, the Viper, DeLuca was arrested at his luxurious estate, completely blindsided. His inner circle, including city officials and police on his payroll, were rounded up in a clean sweep. What Adrian had sensed as a hidden rot was now being carved out at the root. News cameras crowded the courthouse steps. The story exploded into national headlines. A corrupt judge arrested in his own courtroom by the undercover FBI director he had just sentenced. It sounded too perfect to be true, yet it was all real. But for Adrian, the operation wasn't over. At a secure location, he finally shed the persona of Darius Cole. After a long, hot shower and slipping into a tailored suit, he once again looked like the leader of one of the nation's top law enforcement divisions. But the man in the mirror had changed. His eyes carried the weight of everything he had witnessed, of a system not just flawed, but wounded. He led the interrogations himself. Bartlett and McCord cracked almost instantly, each desperate to throw the other under the bus. They confessed to everything: the planted evidence, the cash payments, the standing orders from Whitaker. But the judge himself? He was defiant. He shouted about judicial immunity, accused the FBI of targeting him. That bravado crumbled, however, when Adrian laid out the evidence. High-res satellite photos of secret meetings on DeLuca-Syact, cross-referenced with offshore bank records. Dates and amounts perfectly matched. Whitaker fell silent. The once godlike judge reduced to a man cornered by truth. The reckoning had arrived. Oak Haven's political and legal elite trembled as the dominoes fell. The purging of corruption wasn't just necessary, it was a reckoning, a storm that cleared the way for something better. In the months that followed, the city began its slow rebirth. The federal trials of Whitaker, DeLuca, and their enablers became national spectacles. Adrian didn't testify in person. His detailed deposition carried the weight of the FBI. The case was ironclad. Financial records, confessions, testimonies from those once trapped in Whitaker's courtroom. Caleb Whitaker, now just a frightened man in a cheap suit, was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in federal prison, the very kind of sentence he had once handed out without remorse. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Matteo DeLuca, stripped of his empire, was sentenced to spend the rest of his days in a supermax cell, a king dethroned and caged. But for Adrian Keats, the true mission had just begun. He led a joint DOJ, FBI task force to review every case Whitaker had touched in the past decade. One by one, they overturned wrongful convictions. They gave people back their names, their freedom, their futures. Men and women lost to a corrupt system were exonerated. Families broken by injustice were finally reunited. And Eldon Pops, Walker, the wise old librarian who had helped expose it all, saw his sentence commuted and walked free after 2 decades behind bars. Nina Carver became a local legend. Her refusal to back down in that courtroom became the centerpiece of a reformed public defender's office, now fully staffed, properly funded, and dedicated to fighting for those who needed it most. She accepted a senior role, determined to build something no corrupt judge could ever touch. And then, one crisp autumn evening, Adrian returned to Oak Haven, not in disguise, but as the assistant director of the FBI. He met Nina at a small cafe perched above the glowing city skyline. "Look at it," she said, sipping her coffee, eyes on the lights below. "It feels different now, like it's finally breathing again." Adrian smiled softly. "Justice does that. It clears the air, gives people a reason to believe." He paused, then looked at her. "None of this would have been possible without you, Nina. You stood your ground when it mattered most." She smiled, eyes full of quiet gratitude. And somewhere in the city below, in a courtroom restored, justice was finally being served. People who keep fighting, even when the fight seems lost, Adrian said thoughtfully. Nina chuckled. "I had a hunch about you," she admitted, a glimmer of laughter in her eyes. "Told my colleagues I had a client who was either totally innocent or the most convincing sociopath I'd ever met. I'm glad it was the former." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 warriors who had fought a shadow war on the same side. Adrian had stepped into the darkness to drag the truth into the light. But it was people like Nina, in the trenches every day, who would have to keep that light burning. As he stood to leave, Adrian looked out over the city one last time. His mission in Oak Haven was complete. The infection had been cut out. The healing had begun. It was a sharp reminder. Sometimes, to mend a broken system, you have to break it wide open first. And sometimes, the most powerful man in the courtroom isn't the one in robes. It's the one in cuffs, quietly waiting to deliver justice of his own. 2 years later, the seasons had cycled through Oak Haven, washing away the visible scars of its corrupt past. The sensational headlines of Judge Whittaker and the DeLuca cartel faded into cautionary tales. But for those whose lives had been shattered by the conspiracy, the change wasn't just historic, it was deeply personal. Nina Carver now led the Oak Haven Public Defender's Office. What had once been a dingy, underfunded maze of desks was now a bright, well-staffed hub of justice in a new municipal building. A reform-minded city council had tripled her budget, enabling her to hire brilliant young lawyers, savvy investigators, and compassionate social workers. The office buzzed with purpose. One afternoon, Nina watched as Camilo Ortega, a young attorney from her team, returned from court, her face lit with triumph. "We won." Camila beamed. Motion to suppress granted. The judge ruled the stop had no probable cause. Case dismissed. Applause broke out across the office. Nina smiled. "That's how you do it. You challenge every step, make them justify every move. Procedure is power." Camila paused, her voice softening. "I can't imagine what it was like, arguing in front of Whittaker." Nina's smile faded just slightly. "It was a different world," she said, eyes distant. "But one that's gone now, and we're going to make sure it never comes back." Miles away, inside the unforgiving walls of ADX Florence, former Judge Caleb Whittaker existed in a different reality altogether. No robes, no bench, no power, just concrete walls and an hour a day in a gray yard. He was inmate #7928, DY12. No longer a weaver of destinies, just another ghost in the very machine he had once wielded to destroy lives. One day, during his brief recreation time, a wiry inmate approached him. The man's voice was quiet, but deadly. "Whittaker, right?" The former judge flinched. "I don't know you." "You should," the inmate hissed. "You sent me away. 15 years for possession. Bartlett and McCord were your golden boys." A slow, bitter smile crept across the inmate's face. "Funny how life turns out. I get out in 3 years, thanks to the appeals your FBI buddy started. But you're never leaving. Every day you wake up in this hell, I want you to remember the faces of the men you sent here, because now you're just one of them." He walked away, leaving Whittaker trembling, not from fear of violence, but from the weight of poetic justice. He was finally trapped in the cage he had built for others. Back in Washington, D.C., inside a quiet, well-lit office at FBI headquarters, Adrian Keats reviewed the latest crime reports from Oak Haven. Violent crime was down 18%. Trust in law enforcement was rising. The reforms were holding. Operation Fallen Gavel was now considered the blueprint for dismantling institutional corruption. Adrian had since been promoted. He now oversaw the development of internal affairs divisions in other high-risk cities. The work was demanding, more bureaucratic than thrilling, but it was meaningful. Pinned to the corkboard behind his desk, amidst case files and memos, was a small newspaper clipping. A photo of Nina Carver, scissors in hand, cutting the ribbon on her new office. She had scrawled a note across the corner. "Look what you started." Sometimes, Adrian would find himself thinking about Darius Cole, the alias he'd lived for 6 weeks. He remembered the stink of the cell, the taste of cheap prison food, the soul-numbing isolation. It was a scar he'd carry for the rest of his life, a painful, permanent reminder of what true justice costs. But in the end, it was worth every second. Because Darius Cole was never real. But justice? Justice was. And it was just getting started. But that experience, those weeks spent stripped of rank, freedom, and identity, was also Adrian Keats's greatest strength. It gave him something no other director in the Bureau could claim, a perspective forged from the bottom of the system he now helped oversee. He knew, in his bones, what injustice felt like, and he was determined to spend the rest of his career fighting it from the top. Oak Haven was healing, slowly, painfully, but the scars were still there, a map of wounds inflicted by power unchecked. They stood as a solemn warning. Justice, once corrupted, can turn into a weapon. But they also served as proof, living, breathing proof, that no system is beyond redemption when brave people are willing to fight for it. The downfall of one corrupt judge hadn't fixed the world. It hadn't ended systemic inequality or banished corruption from every corner of government. But in one city, it had cracked open a door. And through that door came a new dawn. The story of Adrian Keats and Judge Caleb Whitaker is more than just a tale of crime and punishment. It's a reminder, etched in headlines and courtroom echoes, that the scales of justice can be tipped, twisted, and abused. But they can also be set right. With courage, with truth, with people willing to stand when it's easier to kneel. Because integrity isn't reserved for the spotless. It can rise from the most unlikely places, from a seasoned FBI director hiding in plain sight, to a tired public defender who refused to give up on her client. And in Oak Haven, karma wasn't just a cosmic idea. It wore a blue vest, carried a badge, and arrived like a thunderclap, devastating, unrelenting, and utterly final. For those who believed they were above the law, justice came, and it remembered every name. Thank you for watching. Subscribe me and hit the notification bell to not miss new stories. Bye.